Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 104 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I visit with Russ Berland, partner at Stinson Leonard in Kansas City, who talks about his heading up of Lane Christensen and their FCPA enforcement investigation. The episode comes in at about 23 minutes, and I apologize beforehand for the crummy audio quality. I hope you find it enlightening otherwise. Thank you very much for listening. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today it is my distinct pleasure to have with me my good friend and colleague Russ Berland. Russ has just completed what I think to be a fabulous assignment where he came out on the other end of a FCPA investigation and enforcement action on behalf of his client Lane Christensen, a Houston-based company. Russ led a team which not only did as indicated, the investigation, but negotiated with the Department of Justice. And the reason I say it is a fabulous result on the other end is they received a declination from the DOJ, and they worked out a civil settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Russ, there's been, first of all, thanks a lot for taking time from your very busy schedule to come on and visit with me.
You bet. Happy to be here.
Russ, one of the things that many compliance practitioners don't understand, and really I think you could shed a lot of guidance on, is how were you, your law firm, more importantly your client, able to work through what appear to be some significant FCPA issues and come out at the end of the day with a declination from the Department of Justice. And that's really why I wanted to visit with you, and it's a great kudos to you that I want to publicly congratulate you for, but also asked kind of the guidance and wisdom that you gained in this journey.
Well, first I'd like to say that Steve Crook, who's the general counsel of Lane Christensen, is really the hero in this story. He made sure that the company was doing the right things from the very beginning. He worked with the board, got the engagement that was required, and the board really took this on as its own. The pieces that ultimately the Department of Justice told us that they said made the difference in them deciding to decline to prosecute were that we came forward and we disclosed almost immediately. We were coming with almost real-time data when we disclosed that we cooperated fully throughout, and finally that the company itself did an extensive remediation of its compliance program and its internal controls. And really the internal controls piece is a piece that was a lot of focus here, and people spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of energy on. And because of that, the Department of Justice was kind to say that they would decline from prosecution. The reason we get to talk about this is that the SEC has recently come out and has published its order, its cease and desist, and so it has the actual facts of the case baked into that. So we have a unique situation where on one hand, the Department of Justice is not prosecuting, on the other, the SEC is providing really kind of the base data around the case. So it gives us an unusual window to be able to communicate about the case in.
And I totally agree with that, Russ. And one of the frustrations I think many compliance practitioners have, including myself, is when a company does receive a very good result, at the end of the day, oftentimes there's not the specific information about what they did. So if I can just sort of walk through the steps you laid out, starting with self-disclosure. What does self-disclosure mean, and more importantly, what does you think that means in connection with the Department of Justice?
Well, we were looking to see whether there was credible evidence of a violation of the statute. And if we felt that we got to that place that it was time to disclose. And from the time in which we had noticed that there may be an issue, moving to going and getting preliminary data and ultimately meeting with the board and then going and disclosing to the Justice Department was really about 2 months total. So it was a very quick process. We were able to get on some planes early on, go gather some initial data, come back with that, and the board was able to reach a decision that it was time to disclose. One of the issues that publicly traded companies run into often is if there's a looming filing deadline, a 10Q or some other kind of, or 10K. In this case, there was a 10Q which was coming, and we needed to make sure that what was going into there was accurate. And so that really forced the decision making, how quickly we needed to move to be able to answer the question whether we had a disclosable event.
So I really like your phrase, the determination of credible evidence. That's really a phrase I've not heard before, but that seemed to be a key starting point. From then, decisions were made inside the corporation to move to disclose to the Department of Justice. Would that be fair?
Yes, that's absolutely fair. And really, the process was led by the board, and so the board was ultimately making the decisions about what needed to happen and when those things needed to happen. And so particularly the chairman and the audit committee chairs were significant decision makers in the process.
You were interviewed by Jacqueline Jager for a Compliance Week article, and you talked about the breadth and scope of your investigation. It literally sounded like it was a worldwide investigation. You had multiple countries. It appeared you had multiple teams from your law firm investigating both lawyers and forensic types. Could you talk a little bit about the depth and scope of your investigation?
Sure. So what we arrived at as a mechanism was we went into a location, we did a series of interviews that were largely for context to be able to determine what people would tell us about the business processes, third-party relationships and such that they had. Then we also looked at the way in which data was kept, because it was not a single integrated network system. There were multiple networks and multiple accounting systems that we needed to deal with. We worked with both forensic providers who would go and image hard drives, and also with forensic accountants who would mine the accounting systems for specific transactional data. And once we had the documents from the hard drives and the transactional data, and the forensic accountants that had time to go and to request the supporting documentation and review that, then we went back and we had really in-depth interviews then with a lot of information on our side. And that was the place that we really came to an understanding of what we were dealing with. The people we were dealing with were sometimes kind of between a rock and a hard place, and they didn't feel like they could be completely forthcoming with us often. But ultimately, we got to where we had a strong level of confidence in the information we were being given.
One of the things that you made clear in your article was the cooperative and almost collaborative nature of your investigation work with the Department of Justice. Can you describe just generally the process you went through?
Sure. So, we came to this saying that, this is really their ball game. They know the rules. They know how they want to run it. And so we simply asked for advice at each step of the way. How would you like us to do this? What information would be most helpful to you? How would you like this information presented to you? And we arrived at a process where when we would gather information, we wouldn't wait until it was completely baked to turn it over. They like to be part of that process of analysis and digestion. And when we discovered something, we would, rather than burying the relevant information in huge document productions, we would give them what we considered to be the core narrative of what we were learning, and then give them the core documents, almost the hot docs file associated with that issue. And ultimately, we would kind of give them the rest of it to look through if they wanted to. But we didn't want to bury anything, and we wanted it to be, from their perspective, a user-friendly experience in working through the investigation. So anytime they asked for anything, not only did we try to provide that to them, but we tried to understand what they were ultimately looking for so we could provide that as well. One example of this was we had 3 people who they had requested to come over from Australia to be interviewed, 2 of whom actually came. And as we thought through it, it seemed that they didn't have enough information to do good interviews of these people. So we scheduled time with them. We prepped them on each of the issues that each of these witnesses were likely to be able to address, and then made witness notebooks for them so that we could walk through and show them the documents that they probably wanted to use to interview each of these people. And as a result, they felt like the interviews were very successful. But it's not the typical litigator approach where you're trying not to provide information. If anything, it's the exact opposite, because ultimately we want them to look at what we're doing, to be able to trust us, and not to have to second guess that we're providing them with all the information, we're answering the questions truthfully. And throughout the investigation, there was not a single subpoena that was issued to the company.
Russ, you said something in there that I found highly significant, and that was the word trust. I've heard numerous people who sit in the chair that you said, who do investigations and or deal with the DOJ, who have also been ex-prosecutors, who talked about the single biggest thing you bring is credibility. And it sounds like you were able to establish credibility with the self-disclosure. It didn't end there, and it continued throughout the process. Could you talk a little bit about the credibility aspect of representing a company in such a situation?
Sure. Well, we wanted to make sure that we had essentially credible evidence of everything that we were telling them. And if we had speculation, if we were providing things that we were suspicious of but didn't know for sure, we wanted to make sure that we couched that in the right way, so we weren't overselling or underselling. And frankly, we would have very candid conversations when we get back from these interview trips about what we found, whether people were telling us the truth, whether they weren't telling us the truth, what documents and caches of data we were able to find. And so it was, in coming to them without having, I'll say, a highly refined product, they were able to look at the processes we were using to analyze and collate that information. And they had told us on several occasions that when law firms show up and they sort of have the whole thing and it's all packaged up and there's a bow tied on it and they kind of hand it over and say, here it is, they get very uncomfortable with that because they don't know everything that went into making that. And by having them see the process at each stage, it really assisted in maintaining that credibility throughout.
That's really an excellent point. I don't think that is really fully appreciated, and frankly, one that's not talked about in the compliance community is just that, as opposed to handing over the investigation complete, tied with a bow, saying here it is, allowing them to see the process so that they understand how you got from A to B to C and why you were telling them D, E, and F when you turn it over to them. That's really a great point.
One thing I might add on that is that, we wanted to be able to answer the question early on, how do we know this is all there is? Because, Lane is a worldwide company. They're in lots of countries, not just in Africa. And so we designed a risk assessment that would be able to assess the potential that there might be this activity in the other places where Lane does business. And the folks from the DOJ and the SEC were very kind in weighing in on the process that we were going to use, even to the extent of editing some of our survey questions and giving us feedback about how we might use better survey questions in the process. So we actually took their input and we went out and did a global risk assessment and survey based on that.
Russ, if I could turn to the remediation that you engaged in during the pendency of the investigation, could you say a little bit about that, and then also about the internal controls you mentioned?
Sure. So Lane started out with what would probably be a fairly typical level of compliance program for FCPA. It had policies, it had training, it periodically refreshed that training with high-risk individuals. But there needed to be more than that, and the Department of Justice and the SEC were very kind in pointing out where those areas needed to be. One of the biggest areas that we needed to focus on was the remediation of internal controls. And so Manny Alas at PwC and his team came in and just did a phenomenal job in helping the company to understand the integration between the compliance program and the financial systems, and the way in which there need to be not only the automatic sort of trips and levers within the financial system, but the compliance program could access the data to do the real-time monitoring, and then internal audit could come back and do the auditing to actually determine. So, for example, a lot of companies have a third-party compliance or due diligence program to deal with vetting third parties before they work through them. But making sure that the finance system will actually send up a flag if someone tries to pay a third party that isn't on some master vendor file. And that to get on the master vendor file, you have to have gone through the vetting process first. So it's the automation of those systems, so it isn't simply telling people you need to and assuming that they'll come to you with the request to have a third party approved, but rather they simply can't get paid unless they've gone through that process. So it's both the compliance and it's the internal controls.
Because frankly, I think that's something most compliance practitioners who come out of a law department function don't fully appreciate, is the integration of financial controls with the compliance system into an internal controls. And hopefully through leadership from people like yourself, that they will come to understand that is really an absolutely critical part of the entire program.
Well, COSO has been telling us we have to do this for years, and sometimes lawyers are a little slow to pick up on that.
Yes, yes. As someone from PwC told me, if I could spell COSO, I get to move to the head of the class. So, at least for lawyers. So, so you've self-disclosed, you have investigated in a collaborative process with the Department of Justice, or at least kept them informed as to what you're doing. You've done your worked on your remediation, you've instituted internal controls. Now you've got to sit down at the table with the Department of Justice, and wouldn't ask you to go into the specifics of your negotiation. Could you describe that process?
Well, one of the things that we wanted to do early on was separate investigation from advocacy, because we wanted to make sure that anything we said with our investigation hat on, there wasn't any question about it. We weren't shading, there wasn't anything else. But the moment we moved into advocacy, you're taking positions, you're using information to your best advantage and such. So what we had was John Munich, who was a federal prosecutor before he joined our firm, taking the advocacy side of it, and then I simply provided data, both frankly to the Department of Justice and to John, and let them make their arguments back and forth, and really just was almost objective in that process, so that John could really put on that advocate role.
So you really split that investigative function within the firm, so that you
right.
could bring an extra level or extra layer of credibility to your entire process.
Right, because they obviously it's a little strange to have the person that you're trusting to give you all the information, 1 week. The next week he's coming back to argue how this ought to play for his client, and he's shading the things that are, there's no, obviously no untruths, but you use what you can when you're making arguments, and I needed to not be in that role for me to be able to really do the investigation and provide that full disclosure.
Russ, one of the things that I thought was key at the end of the day was the company's, voluntary agreement to continue to report to the Securities and Exchange Commission. How do you think this self-reporting or self-monitoring affected any part of the negotiations?
Well, there's always a range of what the SEC could ask a person to do. And, this is on the lighter, because of the issue with the remediation of internal controls over time, this was on the lighter end of that. There were more significant and substantial requirements that they could have put in place. So it was just a negotiated result. Ultimately, I think everyone's reasonably happy with it, and the company gets to spend the next couple of years making sure the SEC continues to find their information credible and provides information on an ongoing basis about both that the remediations put in place are sustainable, but the things that they committed to do going forward are also in place.
I probably should have said this at the start of our show here, but there was a very tangible result to Lane Christensen, because I believe they had reserved over $5 million for
There is, although technically it was a reserve for the entire matter, and ultimately the settlement, the SEC used about half of that. So the reserve that had been in place was something over 10, and then this was around 5. So they didn't break it out between the two.
I see. Well, Russ, we're at the nearly at the end of our time, but I was wondering if you might be able to kind of sum up for any company or lawyer or law firm or compliance practitioner what your experience in this has led you to give in terms of general advice if something pops up FCPA wise.
I would say that if something comes up, get on it quickly, early, heavily, determine if there's a disclosable issue. If it is, don't wait. Go ahead and bring it in, talk it out. A lot of people like to talk, I'll say the Department of Justice and the SEC told us a lot of people like to talk about cooperation, but then they fight about things during the midst of the investigation itself and tend not to give much. Really, it's to be, to take off any litigation kind of patina and just be out there with what the information that you have, cooperate fully, do everything they ask you to do, and then ultimately make sure the company is in exactly the position that you want it to be in terms of remediation, that it's committed the resources, the manpower, the executive focus to get that done. Because if at the end of the day they don't feel like the company gets it, and this has all been a lawyer exercise, then the company's not going to be well treated.
Russ, if someone wanted to contact you to follow up or get any information, is there an email address they could shoot you an email at?
Sure. Well, I'm at Stinson Leonard, and so our email now is a little complicated. It's russ.berland@stinsonleonard.com, or if you just Google Stinson and look for me, you'll find my smiling face and all my contact information.
Russ, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us. It was a huge victory for you and your client, and this is fabulous information for the rest of us in the compliance community about what to do when it really all hits the fan. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, Tom. Good talking with you.